Happy Monday, listeners. Welcome to the Religious Studies Project. I'm Dave McConaughey, and joining me today is
Andy Alexander.
It's so nice to be speaking with you again, the newly appointed co-managing editor and all the behind-the-scenes things with me. It's a delight to officially welcome you to managing all of the madness that is the Religious Studies Project behind the scenes. What do we have in store for the listeners today?
Well, today we have a great interview by Ray Kim with Dr. Noah Salomon on his recent book, For Love of the Prophet, an ethnography of Sudan's Islamic State, where he walks through issues of identity construction and boundary formation with regard to the formation and the location and understanding of the Islamic State in North and South Sudan.
I think Ray Kim and Noah Salomon remind us how fragile the circumstances are in Sudan, and that after decades of political instability and conflicts, that though we had hoped, and many hoped, that the aspirations of the Islamic State would not come too much, they have proved very resilient. And so one of the main questions that's being asked here is, how can we explain why the Islamic State in Sudan was so resilient when, by all accounts, it should have been, or at least the experts thought it should be, impossible? So the ethnographic work that we see here really shines a light on how embedded this political apparatus was in the daily lives of people that were living in Sudan.
Absolutely. And it's a great way of thinking about the issues and questions of authenticity that are so often tied to the idea of this pure Islam with regard to the idea of a state body. And this is something that Solomon really nicely teases out for us in this episode.
Well, I can't wait. Let's listen in.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Ray Kim, and today we have with us Dr. Noah Salomon, Associate Professor of Religion and Irfan and Noreen Galleria Research Chair in Islamic Studies at the University of Virginia, and the author of For Love of the Prophet, an Ethnography of Sudan's Islamic State. His book was published in 2016 by Princeton University Press and went on to win the 2017 Albert Hourani Prize from the Middle East Studies Association, as well as the 2017 Award for Excellence in the Study of Religion in Analytical Descriptive Studies from the American Academy of Religion. Amazing accolades for a first book. He is joining us from Beirut, Lebanon, where he is currently conducting research for the Mellon New Direction Fellowship, looking at the question of how Islam imagines and comes to manage difference internal to its community over 3 sites: Beirut, Muscat, and Khartoum. So, without further ado, welcome to the Religious Studies Project, Dr. Salomon.
Thank you so much, Ray. Thanks for inviting me to this conversation. It's really great to be here with you today.
Thank you for making the time. Currently, I know that you're in Beirut working on this new project, but I would like to start off our interview with focusing on your first book, For Love of the Prophet, an Ethnography of Sudan's Islamic State.
Great.
And to get the ball rolling, let's start by setting the context and some baseline knowledge of Sudan for our listeners who may not be as familiar with Sudan. Can you tell us a bit about its modern history, its ethno-religious landscape? What was the context in which you were conducting your research?
Sure, absolutely. So the research for this book took place, as all research for any book takes place, I suppose, at a very particular moment in Sudan's history. And in order to understand the book and the intervention that it makes, one needs to understand where Sudan was at that moment that I started doing my research there, which was about 15 years ago or so, a little more at this point. And what was going on at that time is Sudan was about a little over 10 years into a project to establish something called an Islamic State. And that project had gone through many different phases and forms over that period. But when I arrived in Sudan, what was going on was an attempt was made by the governing regime to come to some kind of peaceful conclusion to what had been the longest running civil war in modern African history. That is the war between Sudan's north and south. And in order to do that, the regime was being asked to question some of the most basic principles of this Islamic State project, because the rebels in the south were not merely demanding a sharing of power, but were demanding a rethinking of the identity of the Sudanese state and the Sudanese nation. So when I arrived in Sudan, it was at a particularly interesting moment for me to study the Islamic State, because it was responding to a bunch of really unprecedented challenges for it. So by the time my research really kicked off, there was a power sharing agreement in place called the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. And the research really looks at how the Islamic State became this object of debate and controversy, and was rethought and reworked and rejected at times and picked up at others. At this moment where the regime was being forced, really for the first time, to deal in a serious way with questions of diversity, of the sharing of power, etc.
Oh, thank you. You said something, like, I think when we divide, the conflict within Sudan, or between North and South Sudan, it's so easy to see in terms of a binary, right? Like North versus South, and eventually just becomes Muslim versus Christian. But how diverse is the religious landscape in Sudan? Are we talking about only Muslims and only Christians?
Not at all. Sudan is an extremely diverse ethnic, linguistic, and religious landscape. In addition to Muslims of many different orders and varieties, there's Christians of many different orders and varieties, and also people practicing traditional African religions. And these aren't always exclusive categories either. People are sometimes straddling more than one of them at the same time. Also, the logic, which you're right, it was often framed in the conflict of being one between a Muslim North and a Christian South, was and is a faulty one. There are many Christians in the North, both, because many people converted to Christianity in the North, but also because of displacement due to the Civil War. And there are many Muslims in the South as well. And one of the problems, I'd say, one of the interventions that this book, and then some later work that I did in and on South Sudan, which became a focus for me after this book, was on the fallacy of trying to divide, because the idea of Muslim North versus the Christian South wasn't just a way that journalists framed the conflict in Sudan. It became the reality on the ground, right? In 2011, South Sudan secedes from the North, and secedes very much the mode of governmentality through which it seceded was very much on that basis. But it doesn't lead to success, right? We learned that the idea that if you just, stuff one kind of people in one country, or you think you're doing that, and another kind of people in another country, and then we'll have peace, shows us that diversity is like a cell that keeps dividing endlessly, right? That no matter how many times you try to kind of separate people out, you find that new modes of difference and diversity arise, and new places of conflict around those different visions for how the political community should be constituted lead to conflict. And so if you don't actually deal with trying to figure out how to work together, you're going to be forced to suffer the same kinds of conflicts over and over again. That's exactly what happened in the North and South, is that after partition in 2011, we saw the rise of very similar looking conflicts, but internal to those two new states. So one way of thinking about it is that the North sort of tried to cut off the South, but but as you know, in any map, no matter how much cutting of the south, there's always a south, right?
Yeah.
Right. You can't. No matter if the country is an inch
Yeah.
long, you're always going to have a south. And by the south, I mean that in sort of scare quotes. The problem of the south, the problem of diversity, you can't escape by cutting off pieces of the country. And indeed, Sudan has not been able to do that throughout its modern history until today, until the post-revolutionary context that it's in right now. It's also struggling with similar issues.
Focusing on North Sudan, right? How did Sudan's Islamist government, navigate the country's ethnic and religious pluralism, and did their approach and strategies change after the peace agreement with the South?
This is a hard question to answer in some ways, because many argued, and I can see where they're coming from, that in some ways the peace agreement that was signed in 2005, which was supposed to establish a period of national unity, to kind of the language they used was to make unity attractive, okay, before the vote, which would come in 6 years on secession. Many saw secession as a fait accompli. But I think, or I don't think, I observed also that many did not. And the people who did not and really were working to make unity attractive were often a strange mix of people. So, for example, leftists in the north, for example, people who were not moving along with the Islamist project of the regime, they certainly wanted unity to happen because many of their political compatriots were in the South. Also, a variety of kind of, I would say, middle stream Islamists who saw there being a certain kind of promise or model for the future in an Islam that could grapple with and come to integrate, is the word I'm looking for, diversity in successful ways. But you certainly saw, and John Garang himself, the leader of South Sudan, who tragically died shortly after the peace agreement was signed in a helicopter crash, he was not a secessionist. He was a unionist. He wanted Sudan to be reformed from its northern to its southern border and from its eastern to its western border. But there was always within the SPLM movement that he led a strong secessionist tendency, a strong secessionist bloc, if you can call it that. And who thought, there's no working with the North. And there were many in the North too who thought, we can have our true Islamic state only when we get rid of, this 30% of Christians. Okay, we'll have a few left over, but for the most part, we won't have to deal with this problem anymore. So they were strange bedfellows too, right? You have the sort of most conservative Islamists in the North having the same opinion about secession as the kind of most leftist Southerners who both thought we can't work together. And then this kind of whole range of people in the middle who indeed were really trying to think about diversity. And so I did see, particularly in those first few years, before it really did seem to everybody like a fait accompli, I did see a lot of work at many levels, both among government organizations and private organizations, thinking about what an Islamic political order would look like that took some of the concerns of non-Muslims seriously. It wasn't successful. Indeed, unity was made not attractive in the end, and over 90% of Southerners voted for secession. Mm-hmm. But there certainly was an experiment going on to think through diversity in a more serious way than prior to the peace agreement, if that was your question.
Yeah. We've talked, we've both mentioned Islamists quite a few times in our discussion already, but I think it might be helpful for our listeners to kind of take a couple steps back and maybe define what this term means or describe, who the Islamists are in Sudan, right? We have the general understanding of Islamism as perhaps a political ideology, right? That, tries to, referring to, I guess, an ideology that wants diverse forms of social and political or public and political life being guided by Islamic principles or outright Islamic law. Is that the case in Sudan, or does Islamism take up a different flavor in Sudan?
Yes and no. I think you've done a great job defining what the term means, both when it's used in Arabic and in English. But what I would say that's important to know about Sudan is that perhaps unlike, well, I don't want to contrast it, but in Sudan, as is probably the case in other places that I haven't studied as closely, um, uh, Islamist as a category can merge and overlap and bleed into many other categories that are often thought of as distinct.
Mm.
So, for example, and this is part of maybe one of the main interventions of the book in terms of thinking about the political landscape in Sudan and why it has such a funny title. Why a book about the ethnography of Sudan's Islamic State is called "For Love of the Prophet," evoking Sufi poetry or whatnot, and that kind of dissonance was intentional. And what I mean by it is that um, one of the things that the Islamists were successful at doing, if they were not so good at establishing successful institutions, right, a successful legal system, an educational system that didn't become a major area of conflict. One thing they were very successful at doing is instilling some of the principles of Islamism, i.e., thinking about political community in Islamic terms, throughout a much wider segment of the population than just members of the Muslim Brotherhood. So, and I mentioned that organization because it's the sort of classic when we talk about Islamism in the 20th and 21st century, we're often thinking about that organization or its offshoots. Right. But I came to see many people kind of that whereas the activists of the National Islamic Front, which was Sudan's own branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, came to kind of set the grammar of the conversation. Many people were participating in it. Many people were imagining what an Islamic State would look like, and many times in opposition to the regime, but they were still talking about political community in Islamic terms, and those included Sufis, those included Salafi organizations that were not particularly political in their. They were, mostly proselytizing kind of organizations, but also came to think about these kinds of questions that the state was asking. So the state was kind of asking these questions or sparking a conversation in which many groups who wouldn't traditionally be called Islamists became involved. And so that's why, on the one hand, I find it a useful descriptive term, but on another hand, it becomes a kind of meaningless term. The term Islamist, because so many people were involved in that conversation who certainly would not define themselves as Islamists, but we're also thinking about political community in Islamic terms, and the government saw that. They saw that they were not the activists of the National Islamic Front saw that they that their project to create an Islamic State could become more powerful by opening the conversation. Even when it got out of control to the extent of people opposing their vision of the Islamic State, at least they could kind of implant in society a notion that political community in Islamic terms made sense. Yeah, and I think it even lasts post. Sorry to cut you off there, but I think it even lasts strangely post revolution, where we have a highly secularist government in control, we still see a lot of political discourse in what we might call the public sphere taking place in Islamic terms.
Yeah. I mean, everything you just said just kind of reinforces, how I viewed your work as a very creative and dynamic challenge uh, to kind of expand our scope or understanding of how we look for the Islamic State or what we call the Islamic State, right? The usual suspects involved in
Right.
creating what we call it, this quote unquote Islamic State. And your work definitely challenges us to move beyond arguments about the impossibility of the Islamic State as a moral or an ethical political project. Why do you think its supposed impossibility garners more scholarly attention than its feasibility? And how did you get to, where you were to ask that question?
This is a great question. And, let me answer the second part, or the first part first. Why, you asked why the impossibility of the Islamic State garners more scholarly attention than its feasibility, right? Was that how you phrased that?
Yeah.
I think it's first and foremost, there are two reasons. First and foremost, we live in an era in which Islamic politics are seen as anachronistic, in which teleological models of history predominate, in which it's, I think, really hard not to surrender to global norms. We saw this. This is an example, maybe at a tangent, but I think an important one. We saw this, given what we were just talking about. We saw this, I think, with great tragedy with the foundation of South Sudan. Here, there was no threat of Islamic politics emerging, but we had the opportunity in 2011 of starting a new state from scratch, and still it came to be organized in very predictable manners and led to utter disaster. So I think Islamic politics is the same. It's beyond the realm of our imagination. And what I wanted to ask in this book is why and when does it become possible, and who wants it to be so? I think that's a question I understand, and I oftentimes sympathize with polemics against Islamic politics, which a lot of the work on Islamic politics, particularly in Sudan, focuses on. But for me, it leaves a question unanswered, which is why do some people desire it? Very smart and thoughtful people come to desire Islamic politics. What's the reason? Why? What is it? What kinds of problems is it helping them solve? What kinds of futures is it helping them imagine? I wanted to ask that question, and I've gotten hit in many circles for not writing a polemic. I did, of course, and I hope it's clear for anybody who reads it. I do offer critique of the Sudanese Islamic project, which deserves a lot of critique, without a doubt. But it's not the main focus of the book. The main focus of the book is to understand I think a lot of scholars have done a great job telling us about the repressive aspects of the Sudanese state. There is not much more to say. They're spot on and correct. What we haven't understood very well is the productive aspects. What made it endure for all those years, right? They were in power for almost 30 years, and it wasn't that they had a particularly strong state. In fact, it was a poor and weak state at many, fighting wars on many borders. Why did it endure? How could have they lasted that long? Whether we hated the Islamic State or we love it, we got to answer that question for both of those camps. And that's what the book tried to do. The other reason that I think the Islamic State becomes that the impossibility of the Islamic State is discussed more than its feasibility is, I think, many, if not most times, in both the explicitly coming from a religious perspective literature and the implicitly coming from a religious perspective literature, or I should say the literature that doesn't explicitly come from any kind of religious perspective, there's a notion of this is a muddled way of saying it, and I'm sorry for that, but what I'm trying to say is that there's a notion of Islamic authenticity in both of those models, and it's understood to be violated by the modern state, and that's the argument I think you're referring to, Wa'ad Halak's book, which I both read appreciatively in my book, but also see some limits in. That there is a notion of an authentic or pure Islam that is fundamentally incompatible with the modern state. And I'm with Halak in that the modern state is also a political moral order that has its own agenda. But where I depart with Halak is that that there's an Islam out there to be violated by it. I would argue that Islam, since the very foundation of something called Islam, if not before, has always been in conversation with the world. It's the problem of revelation. It's the very problem of revelation is the coming down of the divine into the dunya, or the world. And it's the same problem faced with the modern state. But what I found my interlocutors doing is not blindly thinking that the modern state was just some envelope to put forward in Islamic authenticity, but rather they saw the Islamic State as a very useful. They were quite wise to what the modern state was doing, and came and saw it as a very useful tool to forward a certain kind of Islam that was different from Islam of 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or a century ago. And that was okay for them.
That's what you just said is it's getting my gears turning in my head. I mean, when you talk about these kind of normative frameworks that kind of seep in, or normative.
That's much more articulate than I said it. Thank you.
I have the opportunity to listen and then think, and whereas you're going straight for these answers. But I mean, these normative frameworks kind of seep in terms of how scholars view the Islamic State, and they end up making, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, some of these I guess value judgments about should this exist, right? Should the Islamic State exist, right? Is it a violation, as you said, is it a violation of this kind of authentic pure Islam? And that's just that sure, these discussions are important, and I think they are going to be had, but that's a separate line of questioning than I think the line of questioning that you're going for, which is more of, okay, you can say all you want about whether this frame of political structuring should exist or not, but it is existing, and we still have to reckon with that. Right?
That's why I'm an ethnographer, not a theologian.
Yeah. Yes, that is the way to put it. Yeah. And since you bring that topic up, I guess, what are some other, I guess, advantages that, taking the ethnographic approach to studying the Islamic State, like what are some of the additional benefits of that? What is the edge that you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think the edge that ethnography gave me was to be able to see the messiness of what was going on in Sudan as I found it. And I think there's an autobiographical sort of narrative within the book, as well as the analytic narrative. And the autobiographical narrative, as many ethnographies do, is a kind of schooling. A self-schooling or a schooling of Sudanese interlocutors schooling me. And what I mean by that is that I had read a lot about Sudan going into the field, both primary source literature coming out of the Islamic movement and secondary source literature. And what I found in Sudan was something very, very different. And I think had I not been doing ethnography, I would have painted a picture of Sudan from on high, of an ideal, of government pronouncements, of the ideas of the Islamic movement, and that in the end was not why I went to Sudan. I went to Sudan because it was the really one place in the Arabic-speaking world at the time that an Islamic movement had actually come to power, where instead of them sort of pontificating in opposition as they do in so many contexts, they actually were forced to grapple with the messiness of everyday life, the messiness of the challenges of diversity, of negotiating a peace agreement, of dealing with international pressures, et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of thing could only be seen through the ethnographic lens. In addition, I hope I'm not going on in too much length here. Am I?
No.
Okay. I had to hear an answer to that.
No. Please proceed. Please
I
go to lengths.
Okay. I found the Islamic State. I think I put it in the book. Both more pervasive and elusive than I'd expected. And I think I couldn't have seen that in any way except ethnographic. And what I mean by that, when I went to Sudan, I went to study a top-down Islamization model. I went to study the education system because I thought, where better to study the sort of reproduction of Islamist ideology than in the classroom.
Yes.
And when I arrived at the Ministry of Education, and I did spend a summer and part of the beginning of my actual field work there, hanging out in the Ministry of Education, I found that it was at the beginning of the peace agreement. These institutional offices were occupied by either actual UN officials or people who were working under directives of the UN or various international bodies who were trying to make unity attractive and for the peace agreement, etc. And so the places I expected to find the Islamic State, it wasn't there. The institutions had been taken over by a global sort of governing order, and yet it hadn't gone away. Right? The architects of the Islamic State had kind of implanted it in other places. So, for example, I spend a lot of time. One of the chapters of the book is on a Islamic radio station, a government Islamic radio station that was trying to do a certain kind of Islamic education, but not through the Ministry of Education, right?
Yeah.
through songs, through actually, believe it or not, this whole sort of genre of pious love songs, which has to do with the
DJs
title.
of Islamism.
That's what I mean. Well, exactly, yeah. And so, it was elusive in the sense that I didn't find it where I expected to find it, but it was even more pervasive in that the state was not just found in its institutions, but was sort of spread out through the intellectual scape, the soundscape of Sudan. And the ethnographic method allowed me to, encounter the state on the bus when I would hear this radio station or, other places that I think a more traditional political science method wouldn't have attuned its ear to as easily.
Yeah. I feel like devotion to the Prophet is something you've observed time and time again in Sudan. I think, just the fact that the title of the book, right, For Love of the Prophet, and, these devotional songs that you said was very prevalent in the soundscape of Sudan. Are we correct to assume that this was in part by a very strong, thriving, vibrant Sufi culture? Which is also very interesting because conventional wisdom might have us assume that Sufis don't get involved in politics, right? Sufis aren't involved in building an Islamic state, right? But what did you experience in Sudan? Tell us about this. Like, is that a correct assumption to have?
It's absolutely incorrect. Both in Sudan and historically speaking, we can see many movements of colonial resistance, for example, came out of Sufi orders. Sudan's own anti-colonial movement, the Mahdist movement, was sort of a post-Sufi movement. It was led by somebody who had rejected contemporary Sufism, but was very much emerging out of that. And also in the Sudan that I observed, um, there was no escaping politics because the sort of the foundation of the political order had been made an Islamic one. So to comment on Islam was to comment on politics in Sudan in many ways, given the way that the government had framed what it understood political community to be. But more particularly, there were Sufis involved in all varieties of politics, whether it be anti-regime politics, leftist politics. There were definitely leftist Sufis out there, or Sufis who were in some way, shape, or form working with the regime in power. And the regime saw, and this wasn't just something I observed, but it was an actual articulated strategy that I spoke to regime intellectuals about. The regime saw in Sufism, given that Sufism is so widely spread in Sudan, a real opportunity to attract the public in a way that their Muslim Brotherhood variety Islam that was quite restricted to a small segment of society wasn't able to do. And also a way to kind of work around some of the institutional strictures that were going on during the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, where they couldn't work in the law, they couldn't work in education because they had just made a peace agreement to keep those areas acceptable to those ministries acceptable to both North and South. The kind of sort of cultural work or affective work that Sufi orders were so good at doing could be mobilized to support the Islamic State in a different sort of way. And so you saw, for example, back to this radio station that I was talking about. So the title of the book actually was supposed to be something else, but my editor told me that it couldn't fit on the spine. I'm serious. It was supposed to be a line of a poem from this, or a song put into a poem put into song from this radio station that was called "The People of Sudan Love You, O Messenger of God." And what happened there was I kind of summarized the title with "For Love of the Prophet" with much kicking and screaming because I like the initial one better. But the reason I bring that up now is part of the goal of the radio station was to change prophetic devotion, or to think about prophetic devotion outside of a kind of individual relationship of the Muslim with the Prophet to a kind of national relationship. And that's why the original title of "The People of Sudan Love You, O Messenger of God" was to me, and that poem / song was so evocative of that project, because it really was, to me, in a nutshell, encapsulated this whole project of using the ritual technology and the affective expertise of Sufism to think about a Sudanese nation in Islamic terms, particularly at the very moment that was being questioned. At the first time in any serious way since the Inqaz, the Salvation regime, the National Islamic Front regime came to power, the identity of Sudan as secular or religious was being seriously put into question. And at that very moment, there were forces within the ruling regime who were trying to, okay, how can we kind of salvage this in some ways? How can we continue to think of Sudan in Islamic terms, even when, we don't know what's going to happen with the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Education, etc. And so Sufism became a very useful resource for the regime to forward its project through other means. And I should say, I don't want to make it sound like it was the regime kind of using Sufis. There were many Sufis who saw a lot of resonances and things they were interested in the regime. There were others who protested the regime, and there were others who supported an Islamic State but didn't like the version of it that the regime put forward. There was a whole range of political opinions, and of course there were those who were leftist or secular, etc., among Sufis. So a whole range, and to do the kind of demographic work that is often so sloppily done in places like Sudan and elsewhere. The Sufis are the tolerant ones, the Islamists are these ones. It really is. Once you get there, is just, you see how silly that is. That it's much more diverse.
yes, our preconceived notions definitely are broken down or definitely
Exactly.
challenged once you
Exactly.
get there.
Exactly.
And I think the insight that you have about, guiding us from, understanding Sufism as a purely personal mystical journey of spirituality to, showing us the collective aspect of it, right? The
Hmm.
political communal aspect of it, I think is really needed because we can take a very, a Protestant centered or a Western centered lens at looking at mysticism across religious traditions, and I think if we keep treating them as kind of like looking at these other religious
Otherworldly.
traditions,
Yeah.
yeah, like as through a Western Protestant centric lens, it amounts to just saying like, oh, they're kind of like just these personal trips that these mystics take to deepen spiritual faith and understanding. But it's not just that. There are very collective, political, communal aspects to this that I think gets lost out if you take such a only that kind of lens.
Yes,
Um,
yes, and probably it also needs to be reflected back on, you called it a
mm,
Protestant lens, back on the Protestantism itself, which also probably needs to be complicated in those very same ways, right?
right, 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 right. I think we have time for one more question, and I want us to get back to the topic of Islamization. I think we said that a couple of times as well. Um, how should we understand Islamization? At least maybe at least in the context of Sudan, right? Is Islamization, one may think of that as like a unilateral, unimodal theocratization of government institutions or public institutions or social institutions, or or is the reality more complex than that? Right? Is there a way of these secular, quote unquote secular structures of governance, right, whether that be education or the law or public health, do these quote unquote secular structures have a way of acting back against the Islamizing processes?
Um, okay, I think I get what you're asking. Let me think about this for 1 second.
Mhm.
So tell me if this is what you're thinking here. I'm thinking back to our conversation last week. Sorry, I know you may have to edit out these few words, but
Yeah, no worries. Mhm.
um, so one of the main theses of the book for me, or let's start here. One of the main theses of the book is to challenge the secular religious dichotomy in which so much, I think, of our studies have been organized.
Mm.
The narrative of the book is bookended by two attempts to establish what was called a secular state. The first chapter of the book looks at the British colonial project in its
Mhm.
first 16 years when it came in to overthrow the Mahdist, or the last Islamist regime of the 19th century in Sudan, and establish a modern secular state in its place. And the epilogue looks at South Sudan and its attempt to unravel the Islamic State and establish something that it called a secular state in its midst. And the reason I do that, somewhat strangely, I started a book on the Islamic State with the British and end a book on the Islamic State with secularists, is to point out that many of the problems that the Islamic State faced, particularly in dealing with diversity, were shared by states that define themselves in secular lines, and that many of the modes of organizing religion more generally that the Islamists came to power in 1989 in Sudan used were those that were first established by the British colonial power. So, what does that tell us? It tells us, to me, that this model of thinking of secular and religious political power as dichotomous needs to be rethought, that there's something called the modern state out there, and this is where I do resonate with Halak, that that comes to organize religion in very particular ways, whether it's defined as a secular state or as an Islamic state, that in both cases we see similar kinds of knots or problem spaces that arise. And so for me, Islamization in Sudan is an interesting question, of course, it's the topic of the book, but I don't see it as in contrast or opposition to questions of secularization. I think both often are intertwined, um, are intertwined in a shared problem space.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, absolutely, and it's not so black and white, and I think it really, the complexities of all that dynamic really does come through in the book. It was a pleasure reading it on my end.
Thanks so much.
And for our listeners listening, it's a very readable book. It really is. The complex, complicated topics, of all, Islamization, Islamism, secularization, and all these things gets really parsed out in very accessible ways. So I highly, highly recommend this book. No wonder it won 2 awards. But I think
that's very
that's
generous
enough.
of you, Ray. That's very generous.
I mean, so I think that's about all the time that we have today. I do want to just flip it back to Dr. Salomon. Perhaps he can share with us very briefly about what's to come. What's on his scholarly trajectory.
Yeah, thanks so much. So, as you mentioned, Ray, in the introduction, I am currently in Beirut, and I'm here as a Andrew W. Mellon Foundation New Directions Fellow. And the New Directions Fellowship is a mid-career fellowship. I like to call it the Midlife Crisis Fellowship because what it asks mid-career scholars to do is study something they've always wanted to study but have never had the space to study before. So something new and different. The project that I'm doing tries to take up that spirit by looking across 3 sites, 2 new and 1 old in some sense, but in a new context. And those sites for me, as you mentioned, are Beirut, Muscat, and Khartoum. And the question that I'm asking is how Islam comes to manage difference, internal to its community. We've read a lot about how modern governmental orders come to structure difference into which various religions are situated, but I mean the book that I'm working on to do something really different, which is to look at what resources the Islamic tradition has to talk about and manage plurality and difference. And I mean this both in terms of confronting others and in the sense of performing one's own distinct status within the Ummah or the Islamic community. So for this reason, I'm looking at these 3 sites, one Shi'i here in Lebanon, one Ibadi in Oman, from which I just returned last week, and the third Sunni, but at this moment in Sudan, of reckoning with Islamic politics post-revolution and imagining these new kinds of Islamic futures. And the project gets me into issues about orthodoxy and authority within Islam, the nature and limits of Islamic unity and solidarity, as well as reckonings with history and what it means to think Islamically with the past to create new futures beyond the sectarian map that characterizes the post-colonial present. It's kind of my own What is Islam book, and though it's still a collage with a lot of empty pieces at this stage, it's been really exciting exploring these new sites and doing the work of trying to sew them together in places and traditions that had been really entirely unfamiliar to me before I started on this grant. So it's been a real delight intellectually.
Well, it's been a delight and intellectual pleasure to have you on with us today. And I, for one, am very much looking forward to all your future work. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ray. It's really been such a pleasure chatting with you.
What an excellent interview. And thank you so much to our listeners for sticking through that with us. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode, and we would love to hear what you think. Please head over to social media to continue this great conversation that Noah Salomon and Ray Kim have started for us. You can find us on Facebook at the Religious Studies Project and on Twitter at Project RS.
If you'd like to support our work, we encourage you to head to our Patreon at patreon.com/projectrs. If you are a shopper on Amazon, we also would love you to use our Amazon affiliate link, which is found at the end of every interview on our website. And when you shop, a small fraction of what you pay for items gets donated to us by Amazon. It doesn't add to the cost of the items you buy, but it does help supplement the income that we have here to pay for servers and hosting and all of the things that make digital projects go round. We thank you very much for your time. Thanks for listening.
The RSP is sponsored by the BASR, NAASR, and the IAHR, and is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation. Find out more at religiousstudiesproject.com.
Brought to you by editors Brianne Fallon and David McConaughey, and founding editors Chris Cotter, that's me, and David Robertson, that's the other guy. Our features are edited by Rebecca Barrett-Fox and Lauren Osborne, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bach. Audio editing by Alex Matthews, podcast transcription by Andy Alexander and Savannah Finver, and social media managed by Ray Radford and Candice Mixon.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our Amazon affiliate links or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, iTunes, and other portals. Thanks for listening.